Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's GeoTech Hour. We're thrilled to have you here today in attendance, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. We have some great panelists here who I'll introduce in a minute. A special thank you to those of you who have participated in our standards work thus far. We couldn't have done all this work without you, and I'm very glad you were able to join for today's event. So today's event, as hopefully you know, is focused on the future of the ITU, specifically focusing on the intersection of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the upcoming ITU elections in October. The two may sound disconnected to some of you, so I'll just give a little bit of brief background before we get into today's event. So the International Telecommunications Union, or the ITU, is a specialized UN agency that focuses on ICT technologies and standardizations and regulation. And the thing that makes the ITU special is that it is comprised of both government and private sector delegates, although it is part of the UN. So there's an upcoming election for the Secretary General position of the ITU in October. There are two candidates, one American, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, and then one Russian candidate, Rashid Ismailov, who also has Chinese ties. So in today's conversation, we're going to explore the geopolitical dynamics surrounding this election, and we're going to have a particular focus on Russia-Ukraine issues and China issues. So with that, I'll go ahead and I'll give a brief introduction to our panelists. Here we have Chris Carney, who is a former representative from Pennsylvania, Mercedes Page, who's a fellow with the International Strategy Forum at Schmidt Futures, and then Justin Sherman, who's a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council. If I may, I'm going to ask the three of you to give a brief introduction to yourselves and to your connection to this issue, just a couple of minutes, and I'll start with Chris.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here today with everyone. I come to this issue as a board member of America's Edge Project and as a former Navy commander, former intelligence officer, somebody who's worked in cyberspace for quite a while. And in Congress, I chaired the Management Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee of the Homeland Security Committee, in which we dealt in a lot of cyber issues. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and one I keep a close eye on, or try to anyway.
Great, thank you. Mercedes, I will turn to you.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. So my name is Mercedes Page. I'm an Asia Fellow with the Schmidt Futures International Strategy Forum. I previously worked for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in a number of roles focusing on cyber and tech issues, where I first started working on the ITU, and where I was also one of the lead authors of Australia's 2021 International Cyber and Tech Engagement Strategy.
Great, thank you so much, Mercedes. And then Justin, I'll ask you to do the same.
Justin Sherman, great to be here with you all. I am a fellow with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I also run a cybersecurity and geopolitical consultancy and focus on, in addition to internet governance issues, do a lot of work on Russian internet policy, information thinking. So as has been said, this is right in that wheelhouse and a really important issue to be talking about today.
Great, thank you all for the intros. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. First, I'd like to highlight that if you, the participants, have any questions, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them at the end of today's call. So hopefully, if we have time, we'll be able to take a couple of audience questions. Mercedes, I'm going to start today's discussion with you. Just for a little bit of background, I'd love to hear your take on the importance of the ITU specifically to standard setting, and how is it differentiated from other non-UN regulators?
Thanks. So I think you gave a pretty good very basic overview in your remarks just now, but the ITU is a very little known but extremely important UN body that sets standards for telecommunications and ICT networks. So it was first established as the International Telegraph Union back in 1865 to facilitate international telegraph networks. And then with the invention and advancement of radio, telephone, and other telecoms technologies, and the need for standards and regulations to make these technologies operate around the world, it became the International Telecommunication Union in 1934. Then in 1949, it was absorbed into the multilateral system as the UN agency responsible for global telecommunication standards. And since then, the ITU has continued to expand, and today there are 3 arms or parts of the organization. So there's the International Telecommunications Standardization sector, which is responsible for setting standards on issues such as internet connectivity and 5G. Then there's the radio communication sector, which manages radio systems, satellite ownership, and spectrum allocation. And then there's the ITU-D, or the ITU development sector, which provides technical and capacity services for countries coming online. So it's different from other non-UN regulators precisely because it's an international organization which is founded on a treaty. So it's made up of all 193 UN member states, but as Julia mentioned, it's also made up of around 900 companies, industry groups, civil society members, etc. So the reason why it's so important is because each of the 3 ITU sectors are responsible for setting policy and standards with regards to those issues that they deal with. So they set up study groups which meet to discuss these issues. These study groups then write recommendations which are then sent up to member states to vote on. And then nations then implement these standards. So they're not binding, but the standards adopted by the ITU really influence the standards that are adopted around the world. So I think I read a stat on the ITU website the other day which said that like 95% of international communications traffic over fiber networks is built using ITU standards. And standards really matter because they shape and influence how the internet and technology applies to our everyday lives. So the reason we're able to have this event today, logging on from various devices from different locations, is because of the standards developed by the ITU and other standard setting bodies. And I think the other important aspect to draw out is that standards also dictate economic trajectories and military advantages, which is where the geostrategic competition of the ITU starts to come into it.
Great, thank you so much. And that is a great lead up to the question I was about to ask Chris. Chris, it would be great if you could speak a little bit to the national security and defense concerns surrounding tech standardization.
Sure. Having the standardization is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which, and this is going to sound perhaps a little trite, but predictability. What you want in your national security realm, and by the way, that also includes the economy of the United States and our allies, is knowing what is coming and knowing what you can actually be able to use and how you can interoperate. The interoperability of these things. So, for example, let's talk about our allies in NATO. We share a number of technologies in the Defense Alliance that we can predict. We know that how they will work. If it's the United States using it, if it's the UK using it, if it's Poland using it, we know how they will work. We know how they're supposed to fit. We know it's important to know which buttons to push, right? Those are the standards that come from the SDO. It's important that we understand how much our comms rely on these standards as well. And you know, Mercedes was exactly correct. She reminded me of something. I had a son who was in the Marine Corps, for example. He was stationed in Africa. I could talk to him while driving my car across Wyoming on my cell phone because of this, because of the technology standards that have been incorporated and developed. That's the same kind of technology, you know, the militaries rely on, that the national security elements rely on. But when it comes down to understanding your standards and how things will be interoperable, you know, this, once again, this is going to sound a little trite, but the old axiom is that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, and you really can't plan for anything if you don't have standardized equipment, if you don't have a capability of making sure that things will work across the board. Otherwise, you are reaching and creating sort of Rube Goldberg fixes for problems that exist. So the standardization in terms of national security is important. Standardization in terms of our economy is important. You want to be able to know how things are going to fit and work together. And if you don't have that, if it's, once again, if it's a Rube Goldberg sort of fix to everything, the economy comes to a grinding halt. If that happens, so does our national security.
Great, thank you so much. And then Justin, for your initial question, I would love to hear a little bit about your take on the nature of the two candidates and kind of the geopolitical dynamics that are obviously going to shape this race, and the impacts that they may have on national security and on standardization.
Certainly. So as was said, there are two candidates running for the ITU Secretary General position this fall. One is Russian, one is American. The American is currently running the ITU Development Bureau, and the Russian candidate, as was said, was an executive at Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company. Spent time as the deputy communications minister in Russia, so has spent plenty of time in the Russian telecommunication and government space, but also has, which is, as you mentioned at the outset, quite interesting, that connection to China. And so all to say, there's a bunch of complex stuff we'll get into, I'm sure, around the nature of the votes and where that's all headed. But at a high level, I would say, one, as we've talked about, the standards piece is really important here in thinking about what the future of ITU tech standards looks like, who drives that, what kinds of standards the ITU is putting out. That's a big point of divergence between the Russian and American candidates. But this relates to a second thing I was going to say, which is we haven't talked much yet about the actual internet governance processes and authorities. And this is sort of, at least in my view, the second big piece of this election, which is in addition to all the really important stuff my co-panelist just mentioned about standards and who sets those kinds of rules, is the ITU hasn't played too hands-on a role in actually administering the internet itself. ICANN, the regional internet registries, the IETF, there are other nonprofit bodies that are multi-stakeholder that have done that. And that's the really important piece. They have government involvement, they take government input, but unlike the ITU, they're not driven by states who are voting and controlling what's happening. And so that's the second big piece of this election, is that Russia for years and years, like decades now, has pushed for the ITU to take over those other internet governance functions, because right now they sit more outside state control and Moscow wants to bring them more directly in state control. And so the last piece I'll just end on here is, I think how countries are going to vote is extremely up in the air right now. And we've seen a bunch of shifts in the last 5 or 6 years in the UN in how countries are voting. It was largely bloc-based for a very long time. You had the US, UK, Australia, Japan, South Korea, lots of liberal democracies and open internet supporters on one side. You had Beijing and Pyongyang and Tehran and many other more authoritarian countries on the other. But we've seen shifts. India has started voting with the traditionally more closed internet authoritarian bloc. Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. There are lots of these swing states, so to speak, that have started shifting their votes. And so that, I think, is one of the big geopolitical pieces here, is how those countries are going to vote in this upcoming election.
Great, thank you. And as a follow-up to that, it would be great to get your opinion on whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted those swing states and has impacted the way that the votes seem to be leaning.
Yeah, I can start, and then I'm sure Mercedes and Chris will want to jump in. I'll just say in March, a couple weeks, or I guess it was even maybe just 1 week after, Russia, or I should say the Putin regime, launched its large-scale war in Ukraine. The ITU held a vote and voted to, at the proposal of the US and some other Western democracies, to kick a bunch of Russian representatives out of different working groups and things like that. But all to say, to your question, if you look at the vote breakdown, a lot of these swing state countries, a lot of developing countries, a lot of global South countries abstained. And that to me is very interesting for a couple of reasons. There could be, this is not our problem. This could be, we don't want to take a position on this. It could be any number of things, but that doesn't look great, at least to me, for the fall election, that, you have this moment saying this country is behaving in a certain way on the international stage, but also it's behaving a certain way right now around blocking internet content and trying to undermine the internet. And a lot of countries said, we don't want to take a position on this.
Great. Chris, any follow-ups to that?
Yes, Julie, I think, in some ways, this is perhaps an election between techno-democracies and techno-autocracies here. And I'm really fascinated by what Justin said in terms of the abstentions on the vote. I think a number of countries are waiting to see how long this war might last and what Russia might do in terms of being even more strident and clamping down on the internet and controlling messages that the Russian people are allowed to see. So it's I think if it continues on and for example, say Russia controls the Donbass and says, we're good, we're leaving, things are back to normal, that might be enough for some countries to say, okay, well, I get it, that was Russian territory anyway, and we need to work with the Russians, and then Islamov may have an easier time of it. But I think even before the February 24th invasion, that it was probably, I think Bogdan Martin was making a strong run for a couple of reasons. One is that she was well known and is technically very astute and very capable. But two, the State Department, which they haven't really done in the past, has created an office to actually promote U.S. interest in these sorts of elections. And this office is actually focused primarily on this ITU election coming up. So I'm not going to bet the farm or maybe a few acres of it on Bogdan Martin winning, but I think a lot depends on how long the war in Ukraine lasts, what the outcome is. If it's continuing on through the fall, I think it's going to be a U.S. win in this case. It's not quite like the miracle on ice in the 1980 Olympics, but it might be a bit of a surprise unless the war continues.
Great, thank you. And Mercedes, is there anything you want to add on this point?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I tend to agree. I think that we should be quite cautious about thinking that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will hurt Ismailov's chances of being elected. I think something that we haven't spoken about yet, but we shouldn't lose sight of the uncomfortable truth that there are many countries that are supportive of enhancing state control over the internet and telecommunications and bringing internet governance into the multilateral system. And I think another factor is that Ismailov also has China's support. So where Russia's influence might be weaker or more sensitive since the invasion, there's still China lobbying very hard behind the scenes or, lobbying in support of Ismailov. So I think, I agree with Chris. I think it's going to be a really tight election.
And Julie, if I might add, I apologize, but I think it's important to look at the trends of nationalization of countries around the globe, even before this was an issue, even before the invasion, for example, that there are, as Justin said, a number of countries who are becoming increasingly populist. And one way to control, we learned this a long time ago, one way to control your population is to control the message that they're hearing. And if the internet then or these standards become a tool for these populist-led nations to do that, then I think it's kind of up in the air, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that I would like to delve a little bit more into as we talk about these geopolitical implications is the actual impact and significance of the Secretary General position. What kind of impact does the Secretary General have on the implementation and selection of standards? Or is it, in your view, more of a symbolic election that's kind of just a symbol of this broader geopolitical tension?
Well, and the question becomes enforcement, right? If can the Secretary General actually enforce on a sovereign nation the rules that everybody agreed to? Not necessarily, right? I would love to hear Justin's take on this, though.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's certainly the symbolism to it. I do, yeah, I agree. I think there's material, sort of consequences as well. When Touré was the Secretary General of the ITU several years ago, had a quite close relationship with the Russians. And there were reports sort of to this point of he took over, got rid of a bunch of the existing policy people, brought in his own people. Then there were all these engagements where, the Russians would be brought in first, or the Russian ideas would be sort of given priority. And so I'm not nearly as familiar with the some of those internal workings as my co-panelists, but just at that high level, like there certainly are plenty of opportunities if Ismailov is to win, to bring Kremlin more into these conversations and to put their agenda forward over that of the US or other countries.
I was on mute. Mercedes, do you have a take on this?
I do, yeah. I think that the leadership of the ITU really does play a critical and influential role, with the caveat that I'm actually not very well versed in the mechanics of it all. But I think that we've seen over the last 8 years, Hu Linjiao's leadership of the ITU, Secretary Generals swear an oath not to advance the interests of their country of origin, but to serve the ITU and its interests. But while Secretary General of the ITU, we've seen Zhao very enthusiastically champion Beijing's priorities around, some of the terminology that he uses in his speeches. We've seen some of those effects with partnerships and endorsements and initiatives, such as, signing the ITU onto the Belt and Road Initiative and many others. So I think that the election of Ismailov would be significant symbolically and in practice. I mean, Russia has openly cast the election as a vote, essentially, on competing visions of the internet, this multi-stakeholder approach, or this, greater state control over the internet. So I think that symbolically, if Ismailov won, it would be a bit of an indictment that countries support this vision of the internet. And then in practice, I think that we would then start to see, that top level support to start to bring some of those other groupings that Justin was talking about earlier, so like ICANN and the ITF, into the multilateral system, into the ITU. And yeah, so I think we'd start to just see things like that. And I think another factor also worth mentioning is that the Secretary General is for a 4-year term, but it can also be extended. So Ismailov could be the leader of the ITU for 8 years. So that comes off 8 years of a Chinese leadership. So that's 16 years of leadership of the ITU from China and Russia. And I think that that's definitely going to have a big effect on the ITU.
Great, thank you. And so I guess as a follow-up to that, I mean, we've kind of touched a lot on the Russian side and how this could definitely boost Russia's impact on the ITU and on tech policy. But if Doreen Bogdan-Martin were to win, what would you want to see from US companies and US policymakers in order to really take advantage of that? And how do you think the US could make best use of that election?
Was that to me?
That's to all of you. If you
everyone
that first, then go for it.
Okay. Well, I think most importantly, like, while Bogdan Martin is a US citizen. She is first and foremost an international public servant. She spent 30 years working for the ITU. As Chris was saying before, she has unparalleled technical knowledge. And I think she would serve the ITU and its interests first in a way that Ismailov wouldn't. She's also released a campaign brochure, which very clearly sets out her priorities that she would deliver on if she was elected. So we're seeing things like bridging the digital divide, enhancing gender equality, digital transformation, as well as her track record delivering against those. Very interestingly, though, one of her pillars is around ITU institutional good governance and delivering on its core mandate. And so I think that's really important, particularly with some of the mission creep we've been seeing with the ITU and some of the moves into, technologies like AI and facial recognition and things like that.
Great. Chris, Justin, any specific policies or ways that you think that the US could engage well?
Well, Julie, I would just like to assure as much openness as possible across the tech sector and with the standardizations. And everything that Mercedes just mentioned is the reason why. I mean, this really is sort of a culmination of two visions of how the world works, and it has just moved into the thing that is ubiquitous in our lives now, into the tech space. So, we in the more liberal democracies have a vision that I think Bogdan Martin represents very well, and I am fearful of what might happen if we do have 16 years of more techno-autocratic rule running the ITU.
Yeah, I agree with Mercedes and Chris on that. I think the only thing I would add is, as with any political position, right, thinking about the next election already. I think, one of the US has had a lot of challenges in getting a lot of global South and other countries to sign on to things it's been doing. Now, that's not to make this American-centric, right? Like, certainly, India has chosen to vote a certain way. For example, the Modi government is interested in more state control of the internet. But at the same time, I think certain efforts the US has pursued, even if good in principle, haven't been framed and messaged in the right way, like the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, leaving out a lot of the countries who are the swing votes. Like, in the scheme of things, we're not actually worried about the UK and Japan voting for a Chinese proposal at the UN. So it's sort of moot that we sign the doc, you know what I mean? So there's some sort of messaging framing that has to be done. So as I said, I agree with my co-panelists. I just would add that as much openness and thinking about the next election as possible, and making sure that if the US wins, we really do bring in some of those countries into the fold and the conversation. That way, there's less of a risk, as was said, that even 4 years from now, there's a Chinese or a Russian candidate back in charge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going off of that, what's important to extrapolate from that long-term view is, what can the US be doing right now to already promote those views and promote US priorities in supporting Bogdan Martin in this election? And how can the US meaningfully support her in a way that engages all countries and that is not just focused on communicating with existing allies and existing votes that we know are locked in? I mean, you mentioned that a lot of swing countries abstained from that vote that you mentioned previous to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think, how do we conduct outreach to those swing countries? How can we really pull them in and make sure that people are feeling heard and seen in this space?
Well, I know the State Department has made this a priority election for the international organizations. So we will bring as many diplomatic tools to bear as we think necessary. Justin is right, Mercedes is right in the fact that this is being conducted more like a political campaign than in the past. So obviously we want to see what the results are, but does sort of the American style of campaigning actually obtain around the globe? And then what are we? We certainly have a number of resources we can bring to bear to compel certain votes or to to urge certain votes a certain way, particularly, but the United States needs to make it clear that this is a critical vote to us, and how a nation votes in the ITU in the fall is going to help sort of set a tone for the relationship with the countries that might go the other way. So I think that's, once again, as a former elected person, I did pay attention to elections, obviously, and how they were conducted, and how campaigns were conducted. So this is sort of an American-style campaign in an international level. So, kind of an experiment, but there's a lot at stake in this experiment.
Yeah, Mercedes, I noticed you nodding during that, and I'd love to hear your take, especially given that you're coming in, you're tuning in from outside the US. I'd love to hear your kind of view on the way the US has approached their strategy and the way that they maybe should adjust their strategy.
Yeah, sure. I was nodding along to Chris because as he was saying that it was an American style campaign, election campaign, I was thinking, yeah, like that's exactly what it is. We've already seen, endorsement statements from industry member groups. I was reading the other day the Computer and Communications Industry Association has endorsed Doreen Bogdan-Martin, the US ITU Association, which has, something like 60 to 100 members, has also issued an endorsement statement. And I have no idea if that's normal, but it certainly is striking that, we are seeing a very active campaign, and not one that I have seen to this extent around the leadership of an international organization. I mean, normally all of that lobbying is going on behind closed doors, whereas this one is definitely much more open and in public. In terms of what the US could be doing more, I mean, I'm not actually sure to be honest. That's something that I would have to think about, because taking this campaign out into the open is definitely a significant step, I think. And I think, as Chris was saying, trying to demonstrate that this is a really important vote for the US, and there's a lot on the line there, and that will dictate, future engagement, I think is also something that should be brought to the table.
Justin, is there anything further that you wanted to add on to this?
No, not to that.
Okay,
that was great.
Great. Just wanted to give you the chance.
Thank
you.
you.
Actually, Mercedes, I'd love to jump off a point that you were just making, which is kind of the role of the public in this election, and kind of, there is a lot of courting of the public that is happening. There is this US style engagement that we're seeing around this election. And, something that you mentioned right at the beginning, and I think there's a quote from, I think, Samantha Power, about how the ITU is the most important organization that no one's ever heard of. And so how do we see the kind of relative anonymity and the relative lack of knowledge about the ITU playing into this election? Are we seeing that people are becoming more aware of the ITU, or are we just seeing that people who are already aware of the ITU are getting more involved? And to what extent is that PR aspect going to be crucial in this election?
That is a really, really great question. To be completely honest, I'm not really sure how much the ITU enters the daily consciousness of people who don't follow or work on these issues, as much as I would like to think that, it does. But we've definitely seen that the international community, and particularly Western democracies, are increasingly awake to the importance of standards and the contest underway in the ITU, not just with this election, but over the last couple of years. And some of China's moves at the ITU. So I think that's really positive, as historically the elections of, not just the elections, but, the general goings on at technical bodies have been ignored or deprioritized. Whether lobbying and awareness raising about the importance of the ITU and what's on the line has an impact more broadly on the election is yet to be seen. as I said before, there are so many countries that are, generally supportive and in favor of bringing internet governance into the multilateral system, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything that Russia or China are proposing. But I think the fact that it's a Russian candidate for Secretary General might make, and sorry, I'm talking at the state level now rather than the broader interested public, might make some countries that hadn't been engaged in the ITU take much more of an interest in the proceedings this time round. And that's really important because, it really is a battle for the future of the internet. But how that all plays out, I think we really will have to wait and see.
Julie, I can probably venture a guess that if you asked 1,000 people what ITU stood for, not very many would actually get the acronym correct. So as somebody who has been around and even in Congress, for example, most members of Congress probably don't know what the ITU is and don't understand its importance. So if we're talking about a body of decision makers at that level that really don't understand, I don't think certainly the American public by and large understands the importance of the ITU. Those who are employed in the tech space, I'm sure do. The 900 and some companies globally that are engaged certainly do, but ordinary grassroots people, I'm sure, don't. So aiming a campaign there, I think, is probably maybe some wasted energy. It would take a hell of an education campaign to the American public to understand why the ITU is important to them. Early on in this conversation, we discussed the number of members and how many stakeholders there are. Every one of us riding this globe right now is a stakeholder in the ITU, but we just don't know it. And there needs to be, maybe after the election, some sort of an education on the importance of the ITU, perhaps more. Obviously, forums like this are critical in getting the message out on the importance of the ITU. But also, you have to meet people where they are, and they aren't there. And the fact that the ITU is a body of the United Nations, in some quarters of this country at least, that creates some suspicion. So maybe they're not even, they don't know what it is, but if it's a UN body, it's like, oh, I don't know. Other people understand the value of the UN and international organizations like the ITU, but there are some people in this country who are reflexively sort of against it. So we'll have to see how it comes out. But my guess is not many people will pay attention to the election or even understand the implications of the outcome.
Justin, I noticed you're unmuted.
Yeah. I mean, to agree and be blunter, I mean, no one's going to care, right? I mean, it's like some UN tech agency. People are not going to march and protest in the streets. But I think, like we said, there is a real messaging question, though, and this, exactly what you said, gets to that about how we mean the US, but how the US is promoting its candidate. As Chris said, there is a ton of investment from the State Department about our candidate in this election, which is notable. Because one, we haven't done that too much before, but if you go back about a decade, you have Russian officials at the highest level, whether it's Minister of Communications, the Foreign Minister, Putin's press secretary, Putin commenting repeatedly, publicly, over and over and over about the ITU, which is quite unusual for a country of that size and power. And so, all to say, I think one, as we had said, there's the question of messaging around what the US sort of vision for this is, how it plans on bringing in other countries. Part of this, though, is also grappling with the Russian messaging, and Russian messaging to other countries at the UN level on tech stuff in general, and now I'm broadening beyond the ITU, has not been the way that we analyze it, which is this is an authoritarian proposal to control the internet. It has been that in some cases, but a lot of the time in the last few years that the Russians have approached India or other countries about this is actually our side is not the Russian side per se. Our side is sovereignty, e.g., letting you decide what you would like to do with the internet, as Mercedes said, moving towards a more state-controlled model so that you have the power to do it, versus the US side and the Western side being this multi-stakeholder system where in fact America and Silicon Valley sort of run the show. Which is not to give credence to that, although there's threads of truth to it, but I think just recognizing that part too. And, for some states, we can say, join the US coalition, techno-democracy, and that will work. And for others, we really have to attack that sovereignty narrative and pick apart the fact that this isn't just sovereignty, this will also enable significant Russian control over global internet standards.
Yeah, and Justin, you mentioned the private sector and Silicon Valley stakeholders in this process, and I think that's a really key element that we haven't touched on as much yet. I think it'd be great to hear a little bit about, I think we can naturally assume that at least within the US context, a lot of the private sector is going to opt for less government oversight and less regulation of standards and less kind of ITU involvement in those other areas that they're now starting to encroach on, as Mercedes mentioned, like AI, like IoT, like things that fall outside the traditional, ICT scope of the ITU. So how do you think that the private sector globally, not just in the US, is going to play into this election?
That's a really good question, because as mentioned, the US candidate runs the ITU Development Bureau. And there are quite a lot of people who are happy with the fact that she's run the Development Bureau. At the same time, you have, a white woman from an incredibly wealthy country running development. So there's some issues around that, right? And sort of how that's perceived in some countries. So that's one thing. And that links to the company question, I think, because we have, as you said, a number of companies in the West who automatically almost are going to support the US candidate and who have no interest in a Russian candidate getting elected to the ITU. And then you have a number of other companies, perhaps in the global South, India or other places, who I don't think are sympathetic at all to US tech messaging or like messaging on tech and internet policy, but also are not very entangled with the Russian tech sector. And I think India is actually a great example of this, where, for years, there's been a lot of resentment towards Silicon Valley and perceived US, massive influence over the global tech space. At the same time, though, even as Modi has been quite buddy-buddy with Putin lately, a lot of Indian tech companies have pulled out of Russia. Major firms like Tata have shut down operations, stopped doing outsourcing. People have pulled. I'm forgetting which company just closed a major car plant that it literally just opened to manufacture vehicles. So all to say, there's that piece too that's changed recently, and I'm not sure we're going to know exactly how that's going to play out at this point. They might not love the US angle, but they are pulling back and quickly from Russia.
Chris, Mercedes, any takes on the private sector?
Well, I think that to Justin's last point, I think it might create sort of a third candidate that could sort of run up the middle between the Russian and the American. Say maybe a Japanese candidate, for example. Remember that the United States and Japan together pay for 60% of the ITU's budget. So that itself is important. But rather than pick one side or the other, because it's shaping up to be a fairly clear choice here. If you'd rather not make that choice, pick a candidate who may not be as offensive to either side. That might happen as well. I don't see it, but we are in weird political times now, and if there was somebody, for example, that is not offensive, that wouldn't necessarily strike the ire of either the U.S. or Russia for your vote, I could see something like that perhaps happening. Although no one's announced yet, I mean, I don't think it's out of the question just yet.
Go for it, Mercedes. I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, so I think just jumping off of that, I mean, this election is not just for the Secretary General roles. The other senior leadership positions are also scheduled to be elected at the upcoming plenipotentiary. So that includes the Deputy Secretary General and 3 other directors overseeing each of those different arms of the ITU. So who fills those roles is also really, really important, as is, if Bogdan Martin was successful, who fills, who then fills that role as director of ITUD. So I think that, and I can't actually remember them offhand, but I think the Deputy Secretary Generals were from Lithuania, and I think one was Japan or Korea, and then there was another country. But there were other like-minded countries kind of filling up the ranks, although not exclusively. Like there was quite a lot of diversity in the candidate countries. But I think that's also something that's really important as well.
Great, thank you. I think we've skirted around it. We haven't really delved into the China question as of yet. And I think we'd probably be doing ourselves a disservice if we avoided it completely. I think it would be great to hear a little bit about, China is obviously backing Russia in this endeavor. Ismailov has ties to Huawei that are very deep. And how do we see China really supporting Russia in this endeavor? And how do we see their influence kind of filling the gaps where we see that, Russia has obviously put itself in a difficult position on the global stage? And how is China condoning that and backing that up and supporting Russia right now in this election?
Well, I mean, assuming China is fully on board with what Russia wants to do, and if I think they are in terms of the ITU, you have to look at the Chinese influence operations across the globe, in Africa in particular, and now increasingly in South America. The question is, does China want to stake relationships with those countries on this vote? Does China say, we would really like it if you in Argentina or Chile said, we need your vote for Russia on this one. But so China has to figure out how they're going to sort of triangulate their relationships as they're building them in places that have been traditionally either ignored by the West or sort of underplayed by the West. So China does have influence around the globe, but will they try to spend some of that influence on this vote remains to be seen, I
think. So I think very broadly, Russia and China are in strategic alignment on the ITU. I think Justin was saying earlier that that's not to say that they agree with everything or that they have the same policy positions on everything. But we know that they've released joint statements last year and again earlier this year, committing to strengthen their efforts to bring internet governance into the ITU and work to support China's new internet protocol. We also, I think something else that we should be talking about is the influence of the members in the election. So only nation states can vote, but the 900 odd members can, play a really important role and can be quite influential. And we know that China is very active in the ITU. They send huge delegations. We know that China exerts great control over state-owned enterprises and these groups, particularly in the ITU, where they're extremely active and coordinated in their work to support Beijing's positions. And I think that we can expect to see these groups like lobby hard and support Ismailov. So I think that that's also something that we should be watching very carefully.
I don't have much to add to that other than to say, yeah, there's been little, disagreements. One of the US and Russia for the first time last fall signed a joint cyber proposal to the UN General Assembly. So different venue, but one of the sort of quid pro quo things that was agreed upon to get that done was Russia would kill a Chinese proposal for a data security working group. So that was maybe a little blip of an issue. At the same time, Russia had been supporting it, maybe to get Chinese support, but never wanted it. So it's like, as Mercedes said, still quite aligned and still backing one another. And I don't see that changing, at least for this next election cycle.
Well, Julia, we all know that nation states are actors that act in their own best interest, how they perceive it at the time. And you have to create a perception of cost benefit on the vote. And China has the ability to do that. The United States has the ability to do that. Certainly Russia has the ability to do that. And we will see how it comes out in the fall. But it is sort of a high stakes election that no one is paying attention to, or very few people are paying attention to. And I'm very glad we've had this opportunity to talk about it a little bit today. And it certainly, I think, bears more conversation going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we're seeing this more broadly with these kind of little known technologies or technological organizations and processes are really increasingly becoming a battleground for geopolitics and are becoming increasingly politicized. And so I think that it's important to have these discussions, particularly as relates to the ITU, which is inherently a more political organization. But how do you see these geopolitical tensions bleeding into, or do you even see these geopolitical tensions bleeding into the private sector exclusively? We have all of these different technological standards organizations, these standard developing organizations or SDOs. How do you see them becoming increasingly affected by these geopolitical dynamics, or do you see them being affected at all?
Well, I don't know too much on this topic, but I do know one of the things I mentioned early on was predictability. Major corporations, in order to make decisions for their future, need some predictability. I know they would have a preference on more openness rather than less openness, I think. But if they knew how things are going to be for a set period of time, they could probably adapt. But I think, if most companies are in favor of more openness, less autocracy, more democracy, for example, then they have a role to play as well. They can join the campaign. They can message across their platforms to their audiences, to their customers. So that's something that is certainly possible.
All right, great. Well, if there are no follow-ups on that from Mercedes and Justin, I'm going to jump ahead. And usually what we like to do, I know we're nearing the end of time at today's event, we like to ask all of our panelists to kind of express what they would hope the audience would take away from today's event. Or, if you had to give your elevator pitch on this issue to someone, if you could hope that someone could learn one thing about this issue, what would that be? And what would your takeaway be? So I'll go in order. Why don't I do Justin, Mercedes, and then Chris?
Yeah, I think, as has been said, this is just a really important election for shaping two core things at the center of the internet. One is tech standards, and the other is processes and authorities for internet governance. And we've seen, as Mercedes and Chris said, how open multi-stakeholder tech standards have been really valuable for calling people in other countries, for trying to bring internet access and broadband connectivity to low-income countries. It's been enormously helpful for national security to have, consistent standards where we know exactly how things are supposed to communicate. And so to have, a candidate that wants to continue that going against a candidate that wants more state control of the internet and to not only change ITU standards, but to have the ITU literally take over and essentially destroy ICANN and other internet governance organizations is, really consequential for the future of the net.
Look, I mean, I know it's really boring when panelists agree, but I agree with everything that Justin just said. But I'll jump on that and just reiterate that I think that we really need to not get ahead of ourselves and think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will necessarily hurt Ismailov's chances of being elected. As we've spoken about at length, there are many countries that are supportive of more sovereignty over the internet and internet governance and telecommunications more broadly. And so I think that that's actually where I guess the root of the election and where we'll see the chips fall.
Chris, I'll turn to you to close us out if that works.
Okay. So to answer the question, I think, this is probably the most important election that very few people have ever heard of. And it will affect almost everybody's life on this globe, the outcome of it in some fashion or another. Having more opportunity to discuss it, having the ability to weigh pros and cons of issues, having the ability to actually understand the difference between more of a techno-democracy versus a techno-autocracy, and what that means for a country, what that means for the international society generally. I think that's critical. So, in Mercedes, I disagree with you that agreement among panelists is necessarily a boring thing. I think we are, so that's my disagreement. But I think we all presented a fairly comprehensive view of what's at stake in this election, what it means for the U.S., what it means for countries unlike the U.S., who may have a different view of the world. But it's, Justin's point of we have to think about the next election as well. I think that's important. So if we don't prevail in this coming election, if the West doesn't, if Martin doesn't win, what do we do then? How do we counter that if we feel we need to? So that's something maybe for another discussion. But those are the kinds of things that discussions like this, I think, Julia, really sort of bring to bear.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. And thank you to all three of our panelists. It's been really wonderful to have you on board today. We're very grateful for all of your time and insights, especially Mercedes, who has tuned in from Australia. So thank you for braving the time difference. Thank you to all of our attendees and participants for joining us today. We will be posting a summary and a video of this event online, should you like to revisit it or share it with your colleagues. We hope to engage you on further Atlantic Council events in the future. And thank you all again for joining us today. With that, I'll close this out. Thank you all.